A new NBC News Wall Street Journal poll asked families if they are better or worse off than they were 4 years ago. And the poll found that actually 50% of families said that they were personally better off compared to 34% who said that they were worse off and 14% who said that they were about the same. You will recall, as Steve Kornacki points out there, that in the fall of '92, NBC and the Wall Street Journal asked that same question and found that a majority of families reported they were worse off. And that's significant because that's the last time that an incumbent president lost re-election.
That's right. So Team Rising is here to weigh in on the results. Democratic strategist Roger Fisk and culture editor over at The Federalist, Emily Jashinsky, join us now. Great to see you guys both. It's good to see you.
Great to see you guys.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Roger, let me start with you because this is, probably the single best data point that exists for Trump. I hear it from a lot of people who say that we're misreading the polls here on Rising all the time, which is that, look, you can point to country data, wrong track country data, which is very bad. Whenever it's like 85% think we're on the wrong track. You could put state-by-state polls, national polls. But at the end of the day, majority of Americans think they're better off than they were 4 years ago, and that's always something in the president's in the president's pocket. And so, how do you make of this? Do you think it'll have an electoral impact? What are you seeing?
First off, good morning. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for it's great to be here with Emily. And I also want to reiterate, I arrive at your shores as a civilian this morning. I don't represent or work for any campaign.
Got it.
The poll, the methodology is very interesting. It seems they went out of their way to make sure they had at least a third of cell numbers in there, which sets them apart from a lot of polls. So that's, I think, makes the numbers that much more interesting and potentially valuable. At the same time, having read down through it, it's essentially kind of a Rorschach test for either campaign, right? You can go through there through a Biden set of eyes and find that he's still up 11 points. That 62% of the people think that the country is worse off, even if they think they themselves are better off. And then at the same time, the Trump people can go through and reference some of the numbers that you just talked about. If this was a poll going in the different direction for the president, it would be dismissed and we would be told, similar to the fall of 2016, that all polling is off. And unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember a time when 79% of the American people said Saddam Hussein was personally involved in 9/11. So I've always had a little bit of an arm's length relationship with these things. I stick to my rule, which is basically take any poll and add 5 points to the incumbent. So I think that I would walk into that Biden lead with that. But overall, it's a fascinating poll, and I think the numbers are really, really fascinating and interesting and worthy of discussion.
Yeah, I mean, Emily, when I saw this, I was just kind of like, because everybody, basically, everyone's like, 2020 is terrible, right? Everything is bad.
Really terrible.
It's been the worst year in American history. And yet, this is kind of the commentary modern American history we'll go with. And yet you look at these numbers and half of people say, oh, but for me, actually, I'm personally better off. Even as the numbers they have for the country here, same poll, only 38% say that the country is better off, 58% say that it's worse off. What do you make of that distinction between how people are interpreting their personal lives versus the national life?
Yeah, it's interesting that you kind of mentioned the mood, and the mood does feel so grim, but maybe it only feels grim here in the Beltway, and in these if your job is to obsess over politics and follow politics, maybe that's why the mood does feel particularly grim. But it's interesting because one of the problems with media coverage of the Trump administration is that there has been this false narrative of national misery, when in fact a lot of people have done well. And I mean, we even saw Democrats trying to take credit for the Trump economy to some extent, saying it's the Obama economy. So that should tell you one thing, that some people really were doing well in this economy. But I think it's a question of scale, right? So that 50%, how much better off are you doing? And that 34%, how much worse off are you doing? Because we know that there are a lot of people who are doing significantly worse off right now. And that's a particular, you can categorize things in that sort of binary, better or worse, but there are a lot of people who are doing much worse because of the pandemic and just answering simply worse, and then just answering simply better. When you look at the curious case of the stock market in 2020, that was immediately what came to mind when I saw this poll. You have a lot of people doing really, really well, and a lot of people who cannot find work, are coping with opioid addictions, have shuttered restaurants and businesses all throughout their small town. Manufacturing jobs have left. So I think it's also really a question of scale.
That's such an important
That's a
point,
good
which is
point.
that when you're doing worse, this doesn't account for how much worse that you are doing. Roger, given your experience, you've been on a lot of campaigns, a lot of the presidentials as well. You said something interesting, which is you take the incumbent and you add 5 points. That's actually something I've only heard from one Biden advisor, and that's actually the campaign manager. She sent out a tweet yesterday saying, look, this thing is much closer than anybody thinks, not some of the rhetoric that we necessarily hear from the Biden campaign. What's your feeling on that? Why do you add +5 to an incumbent? Are you worried? How do you think the state of the race is right now?
Well, for the record, I've said that on this show before, so I want to make sure that my thoughts predate the thoughts of the Biden campaign leadership. And maybe I was an inspiration. Who knows? But I do think with the president that there is a kind of reverse Bradley effect where when the curtain is pulled, be it a digital curtain or a mail-in curtain or whatever else nowadays, that there's a part of people that say, you know what, he's kind of a grenade, but at least the shrapnel isn't coming in my direction kind of stuff. And they possibly still buy into the idea of that he's, going to upset Washington and turn it upside down. I think the jujitsu that the president has done is pretty interesting when you start to analyze it. He's no longer running on the present. He's continuing to vilify the past and turn the Obama administration, I guess, into when all these riots and everything that we see in the streets now actually either happened under Obama or they're clips that are pulled from the future somehow from some Biden America. And then at the same time, he's running against some apocalyptic future. The last thing he wants to talk about is the present. And to just loosely piggyback onto one of Emily's points, many of which I think were great, I saw a map this morning of the states where the virus is, growing at such a rapid rate. Right. And it's not far from the map of the states that the president needs to be concerned about.
You're very right. We were looking at the same data.
I mean, Emily, the thing that is also interesting to me here is that you have 50% of people, half of Americans, saying, I personally am doing better off. And yet in this same poll, Joe Biden leads by 11 points in the overall number. So these same people are saying, like, I'm actually doing good, are saying, but I'm going to go with this other guy. What do you attribute that dynamic to?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I mean, I think there's a lot of, I remember actually talking to a couple of politicians, and this was a few years ago, prominent politicians, and they were making the case for why Republicans would do fine in 2018. And they were making the case based on the tax bill, the tax cut bill. And, they were talking about what I think is a myth of the kitchen table voter where they get their return, they get their insurance bill and it's so much lower and they think,
right,
I need to vote Republican. I don't think that exists. And I think, every election is about the economy sort of broadly, that you're existing in the economic climate, which, has been good under Donald Trump. Absolutely. But at the same time, what motivates voters to cast their ballots is not that. I mean, for some it is, but generally it's not. And I think, especially in the era of Donald Trump, people are voting for a lot of different reasons. And that would be my best theory to explain that gap.
I think you're right. And you're giving me some nightmarish flashbacks to meetings with Paul Ryan. So I think panel, we really appreciate it. We will have you next on. We are going to have more Rising for you after this.